Kumar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for your compelling testimony and sacrifice to be here and all the background you're giving us this evening. It's very, very vital to us. One of the numbers that has come across my desk is that in order for the Chinese Communist Party, i.e. government, to continue to oppress their people, to surveil them, detain them, and put them in detention camps, it takes about $300 billion a year. Is that a figure that you've heard before, could verify at all? Dr. Zenz, perhaps? Mr. Turkel? Is it close? Do you have an idea?
I think that figure is close. Here's why I think it's a reasonable number. When you look back, the time that they start building those over 400 camps and installing those cameras, they invested zillions of dollars, and now that's become a political economy. This is why they've been aggressively exporting their digital surveillance equipment. We're talking about more than 80 countries around the world, that includes some democratic nations, adopting the Chinese surveillance. And also the exportation of slave labor-produced products, also part of the political.
You made my point. Thank you very much for that. The point is that it takes billions of dollars a year for them to do this. And where do they get the money from? This is a concern, and in your testimony, Mr. Turkel, you indicate and name names, which thank you for that, because I think it's time we start naming names of companies that do business, companies that fund these people, and companies that are engaging and supporting this type of activity. You named Vanguard, BlackRock, HSBC, Fidelity, and other pension funds. I can tell you, for being on the Financial Services Committee, the CEO of BlackRock recently made the comment that the best place to invest the next 20 years is China. That can't happen, but it is happening, and those guys should be responsible, as you just said a while ago, for that sort of activity. So by naming those folks, how are they getting those dollars into these different companies over there that are helping with the atrocities?
They raise funds. One of those companies in the midst of pandemic was bragging about raising $140 million in China. Just China alone. Ray Dalio, he was publicly acknowledging that his business is thriving. And also hedge funds, venture capitalist firms in Silicon Valley are still making zillions of dollars.
You know, one of the things back in 2020, there were 1,000 Chinese companies on our stock exchange. And then we invested, United States invested $1 trillion in those companies. Right. $1 trillion. We put in place a provision that said they had to be audited every 2 years, because many of them are shell companies, and they're just running the money through those companies into the government. And that alone knocked almost 3/4 of those companies off the list. So as of January 9th, that list is 252. But we're still investing in the company, in this country. Our trade deficit is $383 billion. That's enough to keep the government funded to be able to detain and oppress their own people. How do you get the message across the American people that we've got to stop looking to Chinese products? We've got to start looking for our own, be willing to pay an extra $1 or $2 or $10, whatever it is, for an American-made product or a product made somewhere else in the world versus that of a Chinese-produced product.
Borrowing a quotable line from Undersecretary Silvers, I believe forced labor is a cancer on value. American people need to stop purchasing knowingly. Now everything we touch, solar panels, pharmaceuticals, PPEs, beauty products. As you may have seen, CNN reported the Uyghur woman hair products being sold. 13 tons of hair products were seized by the CBP. How many shipments did we miss? What else that I've been sending? And they label these products as black gold. People need to know that we are complicit in the ongoing genocide.
One quick more question. I notice you come in here with the International Finance Corporation, which is a development arm of the World Bank, allows China access to their funds. And technically, in order to be able to do that, they are supposed to be a developing nation, which they are no way that they're there at this point. How would you suggest us to fix that problem?
The World Bank and IFC have been funding entities that are building those camps. years ago.
They are funding the entities that are
World
directly
Bank-
building these camps. Is that what
There is
you're
an entity called XPCC, Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, that were using funds from the World Bank. There were hearings held in the United States Congress years ago. People didn't pay attention to it. And this is the entity that the U.S. government sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act, and also largely responsible for the ongoing forced labor practices.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. And I commend the fireside chat you did with Undersecretary Silver. It's available in podcast form. It's good listening. Mr. Moulton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first I want to thank the witnesses for being here, for your bravery in speaking out. You've given us some of the most powerful testimony I've ever heard in my life. And it should not be lost on any of us that this genocide is happening today, not at some distant time in history. It's happening on our generation's watch. Mr. Zenz, you spoke in your testimony about the paranoia of Xi Jinping and the CCP being a driving factor behind this repression. I can only imagine two fundamental reasons that the CCP and Xi might undertake this quest to control, subdue, and ultimately eliminate Uyghurs. One is out of fear for the impact that this might have on his hold on power and his strategic goals for China. The second is out of some ethno-nationalist urge for China to be purely Han Chinese. To what degree are each of these at play here?
The CCP is profoundly insecure in the face of competing ideologies. It is a totalitarian system. So the important thing to recognize is that the worldview of the CCP is an ideology where its own ideology has to be dominant in every citizen. And there are two strategies for that. There's firstly ideological assimilation and second ethnocultural or racial assimilation. And with ethnic groups such as the Uyghurs, you have both problems. You have the problem that they're ethnically different and so harder to control. There's a religion, different language, culture at play. So assimilation is one important aspect of this fear complex. But the other one is the loyalty, the inner loyalty. And that's why in the re-education camps, they learn to give thanks. And they simulate the prayer before meals or the singing before meal by giving thanks to Xi Jinping and the CCP for giving me food before they consume the meager ration they get in the camp. In my opinion, what happened in Xinjiang is the Uyghurs were the ones who really challenged the CCP's ability to control a region. And they realized at the end of the day, because the loyalty of the Uyghurs is not primarily to the Chinese Communist Party and the government, therefore, every Uyghur is a potential threat. And I think that's how that expanded. If you look at it, initially there were 4 types of people to be targeted for re-education. Later on, there were 21 types of Uyghurs to be targeted for re-education. If you look at the psychology of how a mass atrocity happens, it's basically a desire for a security that's unattainable because you can't control a human soul. That desire and the fear to not be able to do it spiral out of control. And that's where you move from trying to just arrest individual people who have actually planted a bomb against the police, and you preemptively intern 10 to 20% of an entire ethnic group. That's paranoia, and that comes out of the fear that results from the desire to control, but you can't control the human soul. I hope it's a very complex topic to discuss in a hearing, but I hope I've touched on it.
Well, it's a profound level of fear and insecurity from an autocrat who wants to be the most powerful man in the world. Last hearing, the committee heard a statistic that China spends more than any other country in the region on its military, but it spends even more than that on internal security. I'd imagine that no small amount of that money is going to the enormous technological infrastructure that the Chinese Communist Party is using to perpetrate this genocide and the accompanying societal repression. China has over half the world's security cameras, surveillance cameras. It uses highly advanced facial recognition to know where its citizens are and monitor what they are doing. And then it uses AI to identify citizens for further persecution. Mr. Turkel, could you describe for us what it is like to walk around the city of Xinjiang, surrounded by this technology of repression? How frequently do Uyghur residents encounter security cameras, checkpoints? What happens at those checkpoints?
It is a total controlled police state, Leninist police state. Now it has got to the point of the Uyghur homes having QR codes on the door. The government could track, who lives there, what kind of family history, travel history, family connection. They also forcibly install spying apps on the mobile phones. This is precisely why our fellow Americans here in the United States even cannot comfortably contact their family members out of concern that one phone call, one text message, one video chat may end up causing them trouble, if not straight to the concentration camps. On this note, I want to also mention something that the U.S. government didn't get much media attention. Late 2021, U.S. Commerce Department added to the entity list of a military medical academy and its 11 affiliates for developing brain control weaponry. That has not attracted enough attention. Commerce Secretary specifically said that that weapon to be used on ethno-religious groups. So that gives you an idea what kind of tech totalitarian state that we're talking about.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And tonight's testimony about the genocide of the Uyghur people, the mass internment, the rape, the torture, the sexual abuse, the forced sterilization, the forced abortions, the heartbreaking forced separation of parents from children, the psychological abuse and coercion, all of these human rights atrocities point to the urgent need for moral and intellectual clarity. What we do not need is nuance or ambiguity. We must face the truth that there is a very real struggle between religious tolerance and an evil, toxic intolerance by the CCP, a paranoid depravity that says that if you are a religious minority or a person of faith who fails to conform with the CCP's rigid party-state ideology, then you must be destroyed. This CCP ideology of evil, extreme religious intolerance, and immoral disregard for basic human rights must be confronted, and we must impose costs, as Dr. Zenz testifies. Because the longer it's not confronted, the more the CCP will be emboldened and the more lives will be shattered. So tonight, let's affirm the objective superiority of U.S. Western values of individual freedom and dignity, religious liberty, freedom of conscience, and political democracy over the repressive features of Chinese communism and the CCP's brutal surveillance state totalitarianism. As many of us are aware, the People's Republic of China was elected to the United Nations Human Rights Council. According to the United Nations, the Human Rights Council is, quote, responsible for strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights around the globe and for addressing situations of human rights violations. To any of our witnesses, what message does it send to the Uyghur people and to other oppressed groups around the globe that China continues to hold a seat on the United Nations Human Rights Council?
It sends a very disturbing message, to say the least. We have seen time and time again, most recently, there was a motion to debate on the Human Rights High Commissioner's report on the Xinjiang government's genocide of the Uyghurs. We could not even secure 19 votes, so the other side won. So it's a place for the Chinese government to abuse its seat. That's just one piece of it.
Now, President Biden argued that rejoining the UN Human Rights Council would give the United States a seat at the table to stop ongoing human rights abuses. Can any of our witnesses identify specifically what relief the United States has been able to achieve through the UN Human Rights Council since rejoining in October of 2021?
Arguably, the presence of the United States on the UN Human Rights Council has been a positive contribution, especially for the women of Iran right now, who are fighting every day for their freedoms. I think also in the instance of the case of the Uyghurs, the U.S. did attempt to put a focus on this. And I think what it surfaced was just how incredibly sophisticated the Chinese government's efforts are to counter the efforts of the U.S. and like-minded governments, and why it's so important for us to redouble our work in trying to make sure that we are using every possible avenue that exists to raise the plight of the Uyghurs. It exposed just how far the Chinese government will do. And why is that important? It shows that they do care about their reputation. They do find ways to get other actors to voice support. I know that that might not seem like a significant change in behavior, but I think it is notable that they are monitoring. They're monitoring evenings like today. They're monitoring discussions that are happening in Geneva, at the General Assembly, within the Security Council. I would argue that the plight of the Uyghurs is a situation that should not just be relegated to conversations within the Human Rights Councils. It's a conversation that should be taken before the General Assembly and before the Security Council. And I know that as one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, that makes it incredibly difficult. But the Chinese government and the actions, the commission of these crimes against the Uyghur people is a threat to international peace and security, and as such should be something that is brought before the Security Council.
Thank you. And Dr. Zenz, can you elaborate on your written testimony about the fact that not a single member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo has been designated for the role in the ongoing genocide in Xinjiang? And let's highlight the speech from Chen Quanguo, who led the efforts in the concentration camps in Xinjiang, who referenced the General Secretary who's, quote, sent me to Xinjiang, first not in order to merely be an official, not in order to make a fortune, not in order to have nothing but an empty title. The General Secretary sent me to Xinjiang in order to make a stable Xinjiang arise.
Yes. We have, from these classified documents, now unprecedented evidence of central government involvement in the atrocity of Xi Jinping himself commandeering Chen Quanguo as party secretary, moving him from Tibet to Xinjiang. In the speech of China's National Minister of Public Security from 2018, he said that Xi Jinping was aware that the prison capacity in Xinjiang was a problem, that they needed more prison capacity, and that the central government in Beijing was promising money to hire more prison guards. This is a speech from June 2018. And I think it's a severe deficiency that the United States government has not gone and sanctioned some of these central government officials, not just in Xinjiang, because I think that that's a political problem, because it communicates to the Chinese government what they are saying, namely that it's a local issue, not a national issue. But the problem is the atrocity is a national issue, but you only make it a national issue if you go after perpetrators in Beijing. I think that would send a major signal to the Chinese government.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Kauna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for your very powerful testimony, and I echo my colleagues that I admire very much your courage in being here. I appreciate, Dr. Zenz, your work, early work in describing this as a genocide, which now the State Department, our State Department, has recognized. I understand that your early work estimated that there were about 1 million people who have been detained. I wonder, what is the number today?
The latest evidence from the Xinjiang police files, both from the speech of China's National Minister of Public Security, Zhao Keji, who estimates that over 2 million people in southern Xinjiang are infected by religious extremism, requiring treatment, and spreadsheets, extensive spreadsheets, based on nearly 300,000 individuals in one county, indicating an internment of between 12 and 12.5% of the entire county's ethnic adult population. Based on these data points, my current estimate of mass internment in the region is broadly between 1 and 2 million, and it's on purpose a range because we don't have anything precise. But we can now, with greater, I think, accuracy and authority, say that very likely between 1 and 2 million were detained at some point. We just don't know who's been released, who's been shifted, where. We've seen this huge prison complex And unfortunately, actually, just in January this year, after the protests in Urumqi, after the fire, I've been hearing reports of a new wave of detention, at least in Urumqi and possibly in other cities. There's nothing more detailed.
So currently about 1 to 2 million are detained?
I would say 1 to 2 million in total have been detained. The current detention numbers are very difficult to ascertain.
Mr. Turkle, would you know what the current detention?
You know, I rely on what the Chinese government says in its white paper, stating that since 2015, 1.3 million Uyghurs went through a re-education program. If you add them up, you come up with a staggering number. They said this in a white paper. It has been widely cited.
I guess when I'm trying to drive it, I agree. I admire your work on genocide, and I'm trying to understand what is going to be effective U.S. policy to try to get those numbers down and to try to help in human rights. And so, is the situation improving? Is it getting worse? Do we have any sense?
I think there's a lot of indication that the mass internments peaked sometime in 2018, probably the second half of 2018. People were beginning to be released from the camps into forced labor in late 2018, 2019. More people were being released by the end of 2019, but also quite a few were shifted to high security internment facilities, such as prisons, high security prisons, an unknown percentage. My estimate is several 100,000 at least were shifted into forced labor, probably several 100,000 at least shifted to prisons.
Let me ask the question this way, maybe. What would either of you say has been the most effective U.S. policy that has had an impact in helping Uyghurs in China?
The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
And to you, Mr. Turkle, and also in your testimony, I was very surprised. I'm sure you're right that all these things are still coming from the Uyghur region, because I would have assumed that the Forced Labor Act would have prevented that. Is that just not being enforced, or how are all these products
Here's the
coming
good
in?
news. You know, this is not a lost cause. We are, even though this genocide is still underway, we don't know how many people being detained and died. We're seeing some progress. Just today in the news that more than 50% of 900 American companies being surveyed in Beijing, in China, said they're not in favor of investing in China. So that's a good news. And also, a couple of years ago, Washington Post reported that one major yarn supplier were kind of complaining in their stock exchange report that they lost significant amount of money. On the economic side, yes. But on the political side, in a bilateral, multilateral aspect, no. So if you can, there's a back and forth. Some days we hear strong positions, strong statements. Some days we hear lukewarm responses and statements. And if we have been doing this alone, this has to be a global endeavor. That way we might be able to be able to help in a certain way.
Representative Khanna, may I answer as well?
I think my time's
Briefly, if you would.
I just wanted to make note that perpetrators shift their tactics in response to evolving conditions. And I think we need to be very careful when asking and trying to ascertaining that question of where have we seen behavioral change. We need to actually task the intel community to look specifically for that type of information to help guide the efforts that are being undertaken. There has to be greater enforcement. There are serious concerns that forced labor is increasingly being an area that is now being pushed underground, whereby, yes, we might see a movement away from the types of products that could be coming to the United States, but could be going to other countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So we need to be monitoring how the Belt and Road Initiative and those outputs are potentially being impacted by forced labor coming from Xinjiang and other ways in which that is having an impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired.